All right, in this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about self-fulfilling prophecies. And it's important to note right from the get-go that the Thomas theorem and self-fulfilling prophecies are not the same thing. They're related in that the Thomas theorem allows for self-fulfilling prophecies to occur, but just because something reflects the Thomas theorem does not automatically mean it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'll explain a little bit more a case where we can see that the Thomas theorem is occurring, but we don't have a self-fulfilling prophecy. All right, so what is a self-fulfilling prophecy? This is an idea that comes from Robert Merton, who is one of the most influential sociologists in, say, between 1940s and 1980s, 1990s. And what a self-fulfilling prophecy is something that occurs in 3 stages. The first one is that a situation is falsely defined. So people have an inaccurate understanding of reality. But despite that, people take actions based on this false definition of the situation. And then what ultimately happens is that because of the actions taken by these people based on this false definition of the situation, they actually create the situation that was falsely defined at time 1. So in other words, they take in a false or inaccurate situation and make it true based on their actions and their understanding of this false situation. This can be a little bit confusing at first, but if you walk through some examples, you can see how self-fulfilling prophecies can occur. So the one that Merton talks about at the start of the reading is the idea of a bank run. So a rumor goes out that a bank is in trouble. And what any rational person would do if they hear that their bank is in trouble is they would go there to pull all their money out of the bank, because if the bank collapses, you may not be able to get your money after that point. So at time 1, there's a rumor that goes around that says this bank is in trouble, even though it's actually okay. Nevertheless, based on that false rumor, what do people do? They go to the bank and they pull their money out. And this act of people going to the bank and pulling their money out of the bank now actually makes it so the bank is in trouble. And so now it is actually in trouble. So even though it was in trouble at time 1, because of the actions people take at time 2, based on a false definition of the situation, they actually produce the conditions that were assumed at time 1 at time 3. And again, so even though people are not operating with a correct understanding of the world, they actually create that inaccurate understanding through their actions based on a false definition of the situation. Another example that Merton gives is how at the time that Merton was writing, or at least in the recent past, at the time that Merton was writing, there was a phenomena of African American workers acting as scabs, in that, say, workers at a factory who are unionized are striking against their pay or their working conditions. And a strike only works if not all, then at least a big chunk of workers refuse to show up to work, so this way the business can't produce anything and can't make money. So strikes work when there's a united front. Well, what business owners would do is if their workers are striking, they would try to find replacement workers, and those are known as scabs. And at the time that Merton was writing, it was frequently African American men, primarily, who would come in and be used as scabs. And because of this, then people that were members of unions thought that they couldn't let African Americans into the union because they always act as scabs in these kinds of situations. But what Merton wants to argue is this is actually a self-fulfilling prophecy, in that at time 1, African Americans are soon assumed to be scabs, or the kind of people who would not go along with what the Union wanted or demanded. And so, because African Americans are falsely defined as not being good potential Union members, they are kept out of the Union, which effectively keeps them out of a lot of good paying jobs. And so at time 3, when there is actually a strike going on, African Americans see this as an opportunity for them to get access to good jobs, and so they are available to be used as scabs. But it's only because they've been locked out of the Union that they're in this desperate situation where they would come in and take these jobs and to act as scabs. And so what Merton wants to argue that is, if African Americans were seen as just being workers like everyone else, then if they had joined the Union, then they would be a member of this united front, and they wouldn't be in a desperate situation, and then would not have to act as scabs in this kind of situation. So here again we see a falsely defined situation is made true based on people acting on the basis of this falsely defined situation. And I think Merton didn't pick that example randomly, because Merton is Jewish, and this was an analogous process happened in Germany and other places where anti-Semitism was pretty rampant, in that Jews would be excluded from unions and locked out of a lot of occupations. So the only thing they could do would be either very menial jobs, or jobs that didn't pay very much, or jobs that were dirty, or jobs that were kind of looked down upon. And so this seemed to confirm the fact that Jews were working these kind of jobs, seemed to confirm the anti-Semitic ideas of these populations, that Jewish people would only work these kind of menial jobs. But it's because of that false definition that they would only work these kind of jobs that lead to actions that make it so these are the only kind of jobs that these folks can have at this time. Another example could be seen in the realm of education. So let's say I was, say, a graduate of Franklin and Marshall. Right, that's where I did my undergraduate. I go and I get my PhD, and then I'm entering the job market, and the only job available is for me to come to Gettysburg. And since I went to Franklin and Marshall, I have this understanding that Gettysburg students just can never learn, right? And so trying to teach students is really a waste of time because they're incapable of learning, which is obviously a false definition of the situation. But if I have that false definition of the situation in my head, then when I show up to Gettysburg and I start teaching, if I don't believe that the students can actually learn, I'm not going to put a lot of effort into my teaching because I would see it as a waste of time. And so because I don't teach these students, they don't learn. And so at the end of this process, I look and I see like, oh my gosh, these students didn't learn. My idea of them was right all along. But that's not true. It's I had a false definition of the situation. I did certain things, and my actions made that false situation actually be true. And so with the self-fulfilling prophecy, one lesson to take from this is that when we reach certain conclusions, it's good to think back and say, was this conclusion something that was going to happen no matter what? Or did we take actions that are actually producing the situation? Were we operating with a false definition of the situation that we actually made true? All right, and now it's worth highlighting the point that not all examples of the Thomas theorem are self-fulfilling prophecies. So the Stanford Prison Experiment is an example of the Thomas theorem. The prisoners defined the situation as real and therefore became real in its consequence. But it's not a self-fulfilling prophecy because they didn't actually make a real prison. We didn't actually make a real jail system operate. It's not like the basement of the psychology building at Stanford actually became part of California's correction system, which is what would have to be the case in terms of a self-fulfilling prophecy. A self-fulfilling prophecy would say that a false definition of the situation, in this case, that this jail was quote unquote real, they would actually then need to produce a real jail. Real in the sense of this is really part of the formal correction system, you know. So anyone who's picked up in Stanford could be put in the basement, not just people who are part of this experiment. So both of these can highlight the power and role and influence of false definitions of the situation or misunderstandings. And both can talk about real things that result from them, but they are not identical. Thomas theorems can produce real consequences. Self-fulfilling prophecies can produce real things, even though they were falsely assumed at time one. And one thing that Merton wants to highlight is that he's a little bit skeptical that just having education or just learning or teaching people about certain things may not actually be able to change self-fulfilling prophecies, or it may not be the most effective way of combating them. And the reason for this is what he calls in-group virtues and out-group vices. And what this means is that the same behavior, when evidenced in your group, however your group is defined, is seen as being a good thing. But then when other groups do it, it's seen as being a bad thing. And he kind of talks about this alchemy because you're transforming this good thing, or seemingly what this good thing is, and then you're making it bad when other people do it. And so he talks about the role of like success and achieving the American dream, and how the traits that we associate with the American dream, hard work, industriousness, those kinds of things, could be transformed when we're evaluating, say, someone who is white that's doing these things, and then someone who is a racial minority, so someone who's either Japanese or Jewish, in the examples that Merton talks about. And that we take what is good for us, and then when other people do it, it's bad for them. And because we can do this kind of alchemy, this is why Merton thinks that just solely education or trying to teach people about these things may not be very effective. And so because of that, he wants to emphasize that it's actually institutional changes that are needed to break the spells of self-fulfilling prophecies, because institutional changes will then force people to reevaluate their understanding of the situation. And then by doing that, that's how you can steer away from self-fulfilling prophecies. And so classic examples of these kind of institutional changes and how they can go against and break the spells of self-fulfilling prophecies are, say, like integration in the military, racial integration in the military. Prior to integration, people would argue there's no way that the military is able to be integrated. There's no way that white and black soldiers or other racial minorities with white soldiers would be able to interact with one another as a unit. And so they would do things like, segregate them. And then that would be used as quote unquote proof that these different groups of people can't work together. However, when their institutional changes were made and the military was integrated, that produced situations where white soldiers and, say, black soldiers were working together as an effective unit, that showed that initial false definition of the situation was wrong. And because of that, the spell of the self-fulfilling prophecy was broken. All right, so the main takeaways from this lecture are understanding what the Thomas theorem is, how that can be applied to the Stanford prison experiment, what self-fulfilling prophecies are, and how they're not identical to the Thomas theorem.